Welcome to another mini video from 2dgameartguru.com. Today I'm working in Affinity Designer to show you how to keep a fill consistent across shapes and strokes. The fill tool is an awesome way to create interesting visuals via the gradients. It gets a little bit more complicated when you want to create a gradient that runs smoothly from a shape to a stroke, because the fill tool has two settings for the context, one for fills and one for strokes. I chose an octopus because it can be easily created with circles and strokes with a pressure curve for the tentacles. I start with the circles, create the base shape, create the eye, which is made up of 3 circles in different colors. I group the one eye, duplicate it and move it to the other side. I turn the snapping on, which will be more important later on, but it helps me to align the eyes to the center before switching to the pen tool, which allows me to create the tentacles with fewer nodes than the pencil tool. I think I just need 4, and I smooth those to give it a nice organic flow. I open the stroke settings to adjust the widths and adjust the pressure curve. I want the right node to be nearly at the bottom, so it tapers not quite to a pointy edge. I also add an additional node to keep the thickness quite big through most of the length of the line. I duplicate the curve and adjust the tentacle with the node tool. I try to avoid sharp corners or loops and have a nice flow to the tentacles. I select all 3, duplicate and mirror them for the other side, and then alter the nodes to not have them look too symmetrical and create a bit of variation. Finally, I'm adding the 2 missing arms. With all elements in place, I start using the fill tool and create the gradient. Clicking on the line between the start and the end point allows me to add more colors. I try to create a nice multicolor gradient that flows from a lighter color to a darker and to a lighter color again. Clicking on a color stop allows me to move it, adjust how the spread works within the gradient, as well as change the color. Once I've got something that looks okay, I spread it across the length of my design, move the color stops and spread them out a little more evenly. In order to reuse the gradient for the strokes later, I create a new document palette and make a new swatch in that palette. I add the current fill as a swatch. This way the gradient is stored for later use. In order to align the gradient consistently to the strokes as well as the fill, I create 2 little helper shapes, 2 little circles at the stop and end point of my gradient. I move those 2 with the snapping in place, so the gradient of the fill is now aligned between those 2 circles. I select all my strokes and assign the gradient from the swatch to them. By default it will be aligned horizontally, so I need to move the start and the end point, again snapping it to my helper shapes. This way the gradients of the shape and the strokes align perfectly. In order to darken the 2 tentacles in the back, rather than fiddle with the gradient, I use an effect on top. I set a color overlay to a dark purple, set it to multiply and 30%, and the 2 tentacles in the back are colored in a darker tone. I can copy the same effect and apply it to the 2 tentacles in front and reduce the opacity by a little bit, just to 15%. This way the individual tentacles show up nicely even when they overlap. As a bit of decoration, I add some white circles on top to give it a little bit of a dotted pattern. I just create white circles and put them in a group, assign opacity to that group and the layer blend mode to overlay, that way they mix with the background below. Changing the colors of the gradient is pretty straightforward. I modify the colors and work out a slightly different color scheme for my octopus. I then add that new gradient as a new swatch. Once I selected all the tentacles, I can assign the new swatch. The gradients will align nicely. As long as I edit the strokes with the node tool, the fill will be perfectly aligned. I can move, I can bend, I can stretch. The gradient won't get out of alignment. If I use the move tool instead, you can see here I move a tentacle and it will change, seeing the fill is being moved along with the stroke. If I move just the nodes, selecting all nodes and move the whole tentacle that way, the fill is not being moved along with it. Let's call this one done and do another one really quickly and play around with the suckers on the tentacles. They are a nice visual extra. I'll take the circle from the initial octopus. I copy the eyes and take one of the tentacles and then start moving those into place. Using the pen tool rather than the pencil tool pays off. I just have 3 nodes per tentacle to deal with. I can even reduce them to 2 in parts, and that's a lot quicker to change than a whole multitude of nodes. For this gradient, I choose a dark purple to orange to yellow and give the octopus a really bright color scheme. I create the 2 helper dots. I snap the ends of the gradient to that and make the gradient a new swatch by simply adding it to the document. I select all the tentacles, assign the gradient to those and align the direction of the gradient using the helper dots. I snap the start and end of the gradient. For the darkening, I go a different route this time. I use adjustment layers. One way to do it is via a brightness and contrast, or a recolor, or an HSL layer where the luminosity is lowered. For the recolor adjustment, I lower the lightness and lower the opacity. With the HSL layer, I go with a lowered opacity, a lowered luminosity, and a multiply. To add a little bit of depth to the body, I use the pen tool, draw a simple shape on the one side. I color in the same purple, set it to multiply, move it inside the ellipse and add a Gaussian blur to that shape. For the suckers, it would be easy to create a dotted line using a stroke that is set to dashed. The problem is the dashed stroke does not allow for a pressure curve. Instead, I create a textured intensity brush using a circle, scaling the duplicate of that one down a little bit, using the power duplicate to create a whole line. Export that as a PNG and make it a texture intensity brush. I assign that to a line and can curve it to match the curvature of the tentacles. I fade the ends of those strokes with the transparency tool. Lastly, I copy over the dots from the first octopus and place them on the second one, adjust them where they need to be adjusted and give it a pattern that is pleasing to the eye. On the edges of the body, I deform the circles to ellipses to enhance the idea that it is a rounded object. Using swatches and the two snapping objects either side of the design to align the gradient to made it very easy to keep a consistent feel to both the stroke and the shapes. To keep the gradient intact, use the node tool to manipulate the lines, play around with it, create some variations. I did a few of these shapes and had a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you did, please subscribe to my channel, like this video and turn on the notification. Leave a comment below and let me know what you would like to see on my channel, and I will see you again soon.